So what I'm trying to do is build off the economic concepts that you have learned this week. Now, some of the stuff I do is more on the social media side, the popular side. We have a number of apprentices this year. We have Ryan over here. We've got Bray Sadler. We've got Marissa Bell. And so we've been creating and thinking about digital content, particularly targeting younger generations. And we've talked a lot about the importance of narratives. I mean, really, your view on modern economics largely kind of has historically come from your narrative, your understanding of the Great Depression, for example, right? So the way that we understand the narratives of particular elements of history, are very important for ideological movements. And so that is kind of what I'm going to shape this talk on. Now, our topic is Zoomers, America's most persecuted minority. And obviously, I knew my audience here. So I have my representation of Zoomers. Of course, this is a little bit broad. We do have to cancel out some folks that would not fall in this category of Zoomer, which would include myself. Now, the name of the talk is America's Most Persecuted Minority. That stems from, for those that know the Rothbard lore, I am doing an homage to America's Most Persecuted Minority, which is focusing on tobacco smokers from Rothbard. So that is where the America description focuses on. We're going to talk mainly on looking at some of the specific stats to Generation Z for America, but obviously this is an international problem. Dr. Israel's talk looked in particular about France and Germany and those sort of things. So I know we've got a great international crowd. So obviously this narrative is something that has global appeal. The reason I do mention where I get the inspiration for the title is that anytime I can pitch the irrepressible Rothbard that features this essay, I will do so. It's one of my favorite books down in the bookstore. Okay, so if we are talking about Generation Z, what are the challenges here? Let's look back at what people are saying about this topic. We've got millennials had it bad. Generation Z may have it worse. So again, there's a lot of focus on sort of these economic issues plaguing your generation. But this is not necessarily particularly unique to Generation Z. We have, we were talking about millennials having it worse off than their parents, my generation, right? Yeah, you go, further back there, even Generation X was being viewed as having it worse off than those that came before. And what everyone can agree on is that boomers have had a pretty good run of the gambit here. So why is this? Why is this? So we'll start looking at, what are the aspects that lead to what appears to be each coming generation facing challenges that did not come before. And obviously, here at Mises University, we're going to focus a lot on the role that the government plays on that. And so we'll look first, before getting onto the monetary side of things, let's look at fiscal policy and political policy. So this woman in the middle here is a woman named Ethel Percy Andrus. She was the creator of AARP, which is a retiree activist group. She herself did not have children, which might be a signal of something. And AARP, created as an interest group in 1958, has been extremely successful at being a lobbying arm for retirees. Now, in the defense of Ms. Andrus, we should care about our grandparents. We should care about the elderly. A good civilization takes care of those that came before them. And a lot of the early efforts of AARP was focused on helping insurance prospects, particularly health insurance prospects for retirees, all of which, very, very charitable goal there. But AARP as a lobbying force, as a political force, has resulted in a significant increase in the amount of spending on programs that serve primarily older generations. Here is some projections for the budget going up to 2030. You'll see that Medicare and Social Security will make up about 50% of the budget by 2030. Here is a breakdown of Medicare spending in particular. You'll notice that pink kind of starts a little bit later in the process. That's during the George W. Bush administration. where we keep adding on new entitlements that, again, are designed to benefit retired generation Americans. So here is George W. Bush keeping our promise to our seniors. And that's Chuck Grassley, who is right there, and he's got the red vest. He's still in office, so that's fun, 20 years later. So again, there has been a very successful lobbying effort that redistributes wealth to elderly generations. And a big part of this, obviously, right, is that if you look at political behavior, right, the most dependable voters tend to be older voters. Younger voters are far less reliable, particularly when it looks at midterms and things like that, right? So you have, historically, older generations are a political constituency that you want to take care of, and therefore you're going to keep our promise to seniors by writing checks that benefit previous generations that are going to be paid for by future generations, right? There's this, I don't think any surprising sort of analysis in terms of how we understand the way the state operates, but obviously there has very real generational consequences to it. So let's look at the other side of the table. Here is just the kind of a charting of inflation over quite a period of time. We've seen a number of different charts this week measuring various monetary measures, things like that. I think everyone here understands that particularly since 1971, we've dealt with a major inflationary environment. If you're looking at when the median age of the baby boomers, that target date, it would be 1980. And so that's just kind of measuring inflation to today of just from kind of the 25-year-old boomer to today. Again, almost 300% inflation rate. And so again, as we saw in our earlier lecture by Dr. Israel, is that the consequences of these inflationary policies that we get from central banks is not simply the price of goods goes up, but it disproportionately benefits those that hold assets and investments as opposed to those who are earning wages, right? Your labor is one thing you cannot truly save as an entity itself. You can save the wages you get from your labor, but you've got a very finite shelf life that comes into your ability to do harder labor, to do these sort of things. And so any sort of inflationary environment is always going to benefit those that have come before at the expense of those currently toiling at the present day. And so this has had predictable results when we see the financial, where wealth is held in America today. So you look at the one over there. Again, baby boomers represent the red portion there, which makes up a significant dynamic of the net wealth held in America. The other one, we got just a different representation of the same chart. Again, baby boomers making up about half the percentage of wealth held today. So again, this is the products of the financial system that we find ourselves in. And so I want to talk a little bit about the mastermind behind this financial system. If anyone has seen Murray Rothbard's talk on Keynes, Keynes the Man, it's a very fun book. We've got a written version of it down there. Rothbard talks about Keynes that, look, I'm gonna attack the man. Some people will accuse this as being an ad hominem fallacy, but I believe in both destroying the ideas and the man. Well, I'm going to use the division of labor. We've had a lot of critiques about Keynes today, so I am going to target the man himself in ways that I think are genuinely relevant. So John Maynard Keynes, if you look in his archives, you'll find letters to friends where he talks about particular hotspots in Tunis and other parts of the developing world where the services of both bed and boy are cheap. And while some people have tried to write this off, we have a great independent scholar in our orbit, Ed Fuller, who has spent a lot of time in Keynes's personal archives. Keynes took very detailed notes of his activities, and sometimes they claim with photographs. And so we know from his archives the sort of bed and boys that he was purchasing, right? So, John Maynard Keynes was a pedophile. Now, I think this is particularly relevant because what Keynesian economics does is, like the man, it screws over the next generation. But I think the character and quality of men really does have some important reflection on the people. Karl Marx was someone famously riddled with boils, right? And his philosophy on the world caused a tremendous amount of pain. Marquis de Sade was a pedophile himself, and his works were meant to destroy the innocent in the most horrible ways possible. On the other side, we have Ludwig von Mises, a man of great courage and integrity who stared down bullets because he refused to lie to the government in war service. And here we got John Maynard Keynes, whose entire economic philosophy is about living for today, in the long run, we're all dead. I think those ideas, taken seriously as they are in today's society, are going to have very detrimental effects for the future. What is interesting, though, is that this is now becoming more normed. So this is actually from, I believe it was The Independent. Someone talking about a recent biography spun this in a way that there was an upside to Keynes's commercial activity because it required him to meet people from less privileged backgrounds and less clever than he. So that made him more liberal and tolerant. So that was the upside of his activities elsewhere. So, we have described how aspects of the way the government operates, both in fiscal and monetary practice, and the ideas that have inspired them have influenced, have a intergenerational effects. But if I'm going to prove my title correctly, I must identify there's something about Zoomers, Generation Z, that puts them in a worse situation than those that came before. And a big aspect of this is that, and obviously our lectures here, we have highlighted a great deal, but I think a lot of people, the extent to which 2008 was a radical change in the way that a lot of these policies are done, I think is something that can be understated. Right? Even our own focus, right? We can talk about Nixon going off the gold standard in 1971. We can talk about the origins of the Fed in 1913. But the way that central banks have operated since 2008 are themselves a complete radical change from all the previous bad policies of the Fed itself. And therefore, this has significantly escalated all sorts of aspects. When you have years and years and years of low interest rate policies, which again does not simply affect inflation rates in terms of consumer products, but has all sorts of distortions within the economy. If we are concerned, for example, about manufacturing capacity in the United States, there's going to be aspects to which having low inflation rates or having very low interest rate policies, which therefore forces investors into riskier assets, are going to have massive changes in the way that capital investment, very structural dynamics of the broader economy. It's going to lead to corporate consolidation, and all sorts of changing factors. And so, there is something. There's a whole lecture that can be given on the precise issue of financialization, but we're going to focus on a few other things. But if you're interested in this topic, I've got two recommendations for you. One is this article by Ryan McMakin that you can find on the Mises Wire. It's also in, there's a book I edited called Anatomy of the Crisis, which was kind of highlighting some modern Austrian work and its relevance and modern financial concerns that were going on. It was published during COVID, so it has that sort of tie-in, but it's really not about COVID itself, which is some of the buildup and the consequences of financialization. Another book that I find really very interesting, it came out last year. It's by Rashir Sharma. It's called What Went Wrong with Capitalism. Particularly if you're in a non-Austrian program and you're looking for some resources that might help translate to non-Austrian economists, Sharma he's not necessarily within our orbit. He's an investment guy. He's got a very mainstream, respectable background. His book heavily references Fed sources, mainstream sources, things like that. About as radical as he gets, he says some very nice things about Hayek and his contributions, right? But his entire book is focusing on, again, the damage done by government debt, deficits, and the low interest rate policies of the Federal Reserve. There are some policy suggestions that he makes in terms of navigating the damage done by post-2008 policies. Some of it includes like antitrust actions and things like that, things that we might not necessarily be on board with, but there's a lot of really good information that can be easily translated to a mainstream perspective from that book. So, we're living in a world of financialization. What are some of the ways that this is demonstrating its consequence, its fallout for Generation Z? Well, Generation Z is making less money than millennials did, my generation did 10 years ago. Extremely stressed out about their situation. Doing a direct comparison of median wages. When you take into account inflation, again, all the stats bear out this aspect that Gen Z is doing worse. Again, even with inflation, or if you account inflation and its consequences within their measures. Here is a Generation Z is also is seeing significant growth in government subsidies. And welfare programs, welfare recipients, right? So they are the blue line there. So again, this is compared to other generations, they're a lot more likely to receive government aid. And the interesting aspect on the other side is that this system is not necessarily working. It's not like every single baby boomer is doing well off either. Baby boomers, many of them are concerned about their own retirement. So that goes to the larger systemic issues that are at play. And this matters because there is kind of a perception that, Gen Z is going to be fine in the long run because there's going to be massive inheritance gains made by that generation. But if you've got baby boomers that are concerned about their own current financial standing, if there's changes in investment in inheritance behaviors, then that's going to undermine some of those kind of far more optimistic cases for the economic prospects of that cohort. So also in the news is, again, the direct impact that inflation has had on younger generations. We've talked about that a little bit already, but I'm sure one particular measure of this, which I'm sure many of you have talked about, is home ownership rates in general are significantly declining. Now our response to the housing bubble in 2008 was to double down on a housing bubble. A variety of things. I know I bought my home in Florida in 2019. It is now twice the value that it had, which looks good for my balance sheet, bad for my property taxes, but also not something that if I'm trying to get other people to move in my community of my generation, not good for that. So this is obviously a very major problem here. And as Dr. Woods highlighted in our introductory level, right? Like if you do not have a meaningful, optimistic path that you can see for ownership, particularly property ownership, you're going to put off family formation, you're going to put off having kids, you're going to have a very far worse society. And again, our economic incentives, our economic situation is creating those conditions for Generation Z. Now, there is another troubling trend out there, which is that even though Generation Z is being hit with lower average wages, is being hit with all sorts of difficulty in job prospects, it's not stopping their consumer behavior. We're seeing Gen Z being far more interested in credit products and less interested in saving than prior generations. So again, it's not going to be all how you guys are victims of state policy. There's going to be a little bit of you need to get your own houses in order sort of aspect to this talk. And of course, this is being facilitated in a major way by buy now, pay later apps, which are big demand for Generation Z and being used for things like entertainment, restaurants, and things like that. Obviously, this is not your traditional form of rent, paying monthly for maybe an appliance purchase and something like that. So Gen Z is becoming increasingly reliant upon debt more than millennials did. And more than past generations. Again, this is a very troubling dynamic here. I see I got a redundant slide, so we're going to move on from that. So again, going back to the inheritance aspect, right? Because that's one of the interesting things. There's a number of reports out by banks that again are very optimistic about their role in the financial future of Generation Z. Because again, they like people that take out debt. So it's a great demographic there, and their big expectation is that you're going to see a massive wealth transfer from parents to children within that generation. And obviously there'll be plenty of that happens as we usually see, but we have a massive, we have a very interesting generational perspective in terms of the concept itself of inheritance. Baby boomers, this is a poll by Charles Schwab, baby boomers polled at the lowest rate of being focused on having something that their children can inherit from their financial wealth. Now, it might be, you could argue that it's a little bit easier for a millennial to make this, to say that they really care about, future inheritance, rather than a boomer that's a little bit closer to that time frame of things. But again, we're seeing a very massive change here in the way that where I'm from, we've got a massive active retirement center that is Jimmy Buffett themed, Margaritaville. You see a lot of these sort of focuses on these active retirement areas, and again, what appears to be a broad sort of cultural change in the way that the preference for consuming the wealth that they have made throughout their life rather than passing it on to future generations. Now, the result of all of this should not be particularly surprising. We see growing cynicism of free markets, of capitalism, a rising anti-capitalist mentality, to use a phrase from Mises. This is a headline which was just very useful as an illustrating tool. The information down below, though, comes from a survey by the Wake Forest research. They have a research center dedicated to capitalism. They see that only less than half of Gen Z views the profit system itself as something that rewards hard work and success. 64% of Gen Z thinks entrepreneurs are successful because of their contacts, not because of the way they can better serve the market. You see just growing cynicism of the concept of meritocracy, right? That the worst rise to the top. And there's perhaps most troubling, less than half of Gen Z views a person who is not willing to work hard as a problem here. So again, it's the economic environment that they have found themselves in, dictated by policy, dictated by bad economic ideas, is corrupting a large percentage of younger generations' view of really foundational pillars to civilization and social well-being right here. This is very, very concerning. Now, there are some silver linings. There are some positives that I do want to highlight as a backlash to some of these economic issues. One is that Gen Z is very big into crypto. Various surveys show that Gen Z is over half surveyed have owned crypto at some point. And we also see a significant decay in the trust of political institutions. So this is true almost across the board. Now, one thing that's really concerning here is that the top thing, I don't know if you can see it, but the institution that polled the best was the institution of science. And I would think that a generation that was particularly affected by the damage done by COVID tyranny would be a little bit more skeptical of the science than other things. But outside of that, we see significant distrust in the news for reasons that Mr. O'Keefe mentioned earlier. We see it in police, we see it in the criminal justice system, we see it in the Supreme Court, we see it in Congress, we see it in the presidency, we see it across the board, that there is growing a far greater cynicism and skepticism of these political institutions that have long been taken for granted. And so again, this in theory is an opportunity for very real positive political radical change. And so that is what I'm going to lead into for the rest of the talk. Now, first and foremost is that I've identified a lot of the policy consequences that are unique to Generation Z, but I don't want to dare suggest that your generation is by far has it the worst than anyone else in history, right? You don't have massive world wars such as the type that this gentleman fought in, right? Again, bad economic policy, you're bearing the brunt of it, but things could be worse, right? Things could be worse. And so, if Ludwig von Mises could find himself to be inspired to do extraordinary things, then there's no reason why your generation can't be as well. And it's in all of our interest to try to make sure that your generation and those that come after it recognize that we need merit. We need price signals. We need private property. We need all the concepts that we've learned this week, because these themselves are the key for growing civilization, and it's the rejection of the sort of knowledge that we've gotten here this week that has led to the economic problems that they are facing. And so we've got one of my favorite Mises quotes: "No one can find a safe way out for himself if society is sweeping towards destruction. Therefore, everyone in his own interest must thrust himself vigorously into the intellectual battle. None can stand aside with unconcern. The interests of everyone hang on the result. Whether he chooses or not, every man is drawn into the great historical struggle, the decisive battle into which our epoch has plunged us." And so, my action item to all of you is that, having been here at Mises U, is find your own ways of getting this narrative that, yes, you are, there are aspects that suck about being in Generation Z, that the economy is rigged against you, that a lot of the critiques that you might hear from leftists in terms of, again, ways the system is rigged against, all the nice things in the world, those things are true. But what matters is that we've got a different narrative. We've got a different answer for what is causing these things, right? It's the rejection of sound economics. It is not the consequence of free market capitalism itself. And so with someone else who I think when it comes to strategy of ideological movements is just, there's always something new to discover. We're gonna go back to the man that inspired the title of the talk, Murray Rothbard. There's a great long article for those of you that are interested in Rothbardian strategy as a subdiscipline of his work. It's called A Strategy for Libertarian Social Change. It's unpublished. David Hart, the economist, is a great Bastiat scholar. He's got it on his website as an HTML format. There's a PDF format out there. I'm working on formatting it for our site right now. But there's a lot of great stuff in terms of just what leads to successful radical political movements throughout history. And one of the aspects that you hear in the discourse from James Lindsay and the right, that's this concept of like a woke right? And then it seems to me that, depending on, sometimes there's kind of singular concerns, sometimes foreign policy related, which are kind of used to peg, who's woke and who's, okay, right? But I think the closest to like a sincere criticism or sincere definition that is provided by some of these folks is they criticize using sort of class analysis from a right-wing point of view. But of course, this is something, classical liberal class analysis is something that predates Marxism. And so there's something we can learn from that. And so within this strategy memo, Rothbard talks about the lessons that we can use from the growth of the success of Marxist ideological projects. And I think there's some relevance here in terms of how we should consider these generational grievances going forward. So from Rothbard, the fundamental aim of Marxian propaganda and agitation is to explain to the masses their own interests, or in the Marxian terms, to transform or raise the false consciousness of the exploited and oppressed classes into a correct consciousness of their plight. In short, the Marxists, as do libertarians, identify certain majority classes of society who are being oppressed by other minority classes. Thus, they implicitly adopt the Humean view of the state that its continued rule rests on majority support. There are, of course, differences in accordance with their different theories. Marxists wish to desanctify and eliminate the existing feudal order or capitalist state and replace it by the dictatorship of the proletariat. Libertarians wish to desanctify and eliminate the state itself. This difference stems from different views on who is being exploited and who is doing the exploiting. Both groups have a theory about who the good guys and who the bad guys are, and both groups wish to explain to the deluded good guys the nature of the bad guys and of the continuing oppression of the former group. The difference is contrasting perceptions about who the good guys and the bad guys happen to be. So again, to me, this is the core of why this narrative is so important, is that we must identify that the bad guys that are screwing over your generation, it's the central banks, it's the government, it's those that are advocating for those ideas. It is the Keynesians that still walk among us. And on contrast, the good guys are the ones that identify these as problems. And it also requires us to think about these sort of lines, right? That we need to elevate and escalate and focus on recognizing that Gen Z is a generation that are victims from the state and should be elevated. We should take your concerns, your considerations seriously. And I think there's a lot of opportunity here in trying to create a more Rothbardian generation by addressing these things head on. Rothbard also critiques, and that's what I'm conclude with, classical liberals. And so his analysis on why did classical liberalism end up dying out, petering out, is that the classical liberals had lost a lot of their edge. They kind of lost sort of this exploiter versus the victim group dynamic. It's interesting, if you read like the Jacksonian movement that Patrick Newman talked about a little bit earlier, you get a lot of very radical language. Like you can kind of see why Marxism has some success a few decades later based off how radical the rhetoric was, but it was great stuff. It was identifying the working class, are the ones being the victims of the financial speculators and, or benefit from free trade. There's a lot of really, really good liberal class analysis stuff in here. And it was losing it that Rothbard credits with kind of the weakening of the classical liberal political project. As you noted, in the 18th and first half of the 19th centuries, the classical liberals were not only a consistent intellectual movement, they were leaders of genuine mass movement. Indeed, they led the masses in their attack on the aristocratic monarchical old order. In the 17th century, at the beginning, they were the levelers. They were in America, they were the Sam Adams and the Henrys and the Paynes. In the 19th century, they were the James Mills, the radicals in America. They were the Jacksonians, all these great guys. They were not afraid of bringing the masses into social and political action because they realized that their interests of the masses were in opposition to their exploitation of the old oligarchic elite. But in the 19th century, the English classical liberals, for example, began to sit on the laurels of their partial triumphs and to begin concentrating, as Hayek points out, on niggling short-run details rather on their own broad worldview. This inner failure of classical liberalism is being replicated in today's heirs of English classical economics, the Chicago School. While Friedman and the Chicago School have had great influence over the profession of economics, they are unlikely to have much influence outside of that important but narrow sphere. For their emphasis, and Friedman and even more and his followers such as Becker, Holtzman, Alchin, and Tulloch, are focused not on general principles, let alone on moral principles, but on ad hoc empirical and mechanistic analysis of concrete issues and strictly on efficiency and cost-benefit grounds. Therefore, they've lost the plot. They've lost this sort of crusade. They've lost the beating of the hearts of man necessary to really fight for the ideas of liberty. And so I hope that, by having the experience I've had this week, which is unique, being around the people that you've met this week from all around the world, having the mentor relationship that hopefully you've been able to utilize talking to faculty members of various generations of the Austrian School, hopefully you will take these ideas and act upon them. That you will become, you'll become evangelizing these very, very important aspects, key to the prospects of civilization. If we do that, we can destroy the Keynesian menace among us and have a better generation, a better future for all generations, including Generation Z. Thank you very much.